viewers, an interaction with Dr. Raghuram Rajan, former Governor, Reserve Bank of India, presently Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Prior to taking over as RBI Governor, Dr. Rajan served as Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India, and also as Chief Economist, International Monetary Fund. So he brings to the table a rare blend of domestic and international experience and across both the fiscal and the monetary policy spheres. Welcome to the show, Dr. Rajan.
Thank you for having me.
It's almost a year to the day we spoke in January 2021. And though the pandemic has not entirely disappeared, we've seen a sea change in the state of the global economy, India included. At the beginning of 2021, global growth had contracted 3.5%, and India was expected to contract 7.5%. Of course, we ended the year a little bit better at 7.3%. But now in Jan 2022, things are very different. The global economy is estimated to have grown at 6% in 2021, while India is expected to grow at 9.2%. So let me begin by asking you, how do you see global growth in 2022? Will the recovery continue, or will it peter out in the face of Omicron? We'll come to India later, but for now, your view of the global economy, Raghu.
Well, I think the global economy is buoyed by a substantial reservoir of demand. So notwithstanding the Omicron virus and the devastation it is already causing, I think there will be a slowdown in this quarter's activity, but it'll get pushed a little further. That said, I would resist the temptation to say we've seen the worst, the virus is behind us. This virus is ever morphing. As you know, when we talked in early last year, we didn't imagine the extent to which Delta would be vicious. And of course, Omicron there could be variants which are far more deadly than this one. So, I think we should have a cautious optimism that, there is globally sufficient sort of pent-up demand, reservoirs of stimulus, that the economy will still grow quite substantially, the global economy next year, or this year, I should say. But we still have to be careful in making too many strong predictions given the ever-morphing virus.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, you're entirely right. In Jan 2021, when we spoke, nobody knew what it is, just 2 or 3 months down the line. But coming specifically to the US economy, with inflation now touching a 40-year high in the US, the Federal Reserve has been accused of being behind the curve on inflation and has now indicated a much faster end to its easy monetary policy. How will this impact the global economy and EMEs like India in particular?
Well, the Federal Reserve is the most important central bank in the world. And clearly, a lot of what it does is driven not so much by global conditions, but by US conditions. That said, inflation in Europe is also reasonably high. It's in 5%, for example, in Germany. So there are concerns about inflation in the other big central bank, the ECB. I think you see across emerging markets, inflation is picking up. So if the Fed moves, and it certainly has indicated its desire to move starting March, it is not going to be sort of out of the ordinary for the world. Inflation has been picking up quite strongly. Now, some of this is transient, even though the Fed has retired that term, in the sense that it comes from the coronavirus linked supply disruptions. But there's something far more deeper, stronger in there. If you look at energy prices have been moving up. Some of that has to do with long-term underinvestment in oil, in some aspects of natural gas. And that is coming to hit us now because now the global economy is recovering. There's much more demand for energy. It's an important issue for India because it's such a big part of our consumption basket. The other thing which has longer legs is certainly house prices. They've been on a tear and they show up in inflation over time only. But the biggest source of concern has to be the labor market because that's where inflationary expectations get embedded and then get pushed forward. And what you're seeing is perhaps some of the tightest labor conditions that the US has seen for a long, long time. Even though earlier it was a 3.5% unemployment, Now it's at 3.9. So there's still, theoretically some room to go. But you talk to employers across the board, they just find it impossible to find workers. And part of the reason is that the unemployed workers are not where the jobs are. So New York City has unemployment of 9% because many restaurants are still closed. Many of the service industry has still not come back fully. But on the other hand, in any manufacturing city, you ask and you find people are willing to hire anybody who walks off the street who passes a drug test, but it's just impossible to find workers. So what we're seeing is a red-hot labor market with wages going up at the lower end, but it is translating to higher wages across the board. And if this gets entrenched, no matter whether the cause was supply constraints or stimulus demand, it gets a momentum of its own. Wage pushing inflation becomes a problem, and this is something the Fed is really worried about, that it should not become entrenched. And that's why it's been started making very loud noises, not just about raising interest rates. What was interesting about the minutes that came out a few days ago is they're also talking about pulling back the size of the balance sheet. And that's an interesting new development. They want to actually shrink, which means that there could be effects on both liquidity as well as long-term interest rates in the US, which again feeds into the rest of the world.
Look, there's been a lot of brave talk in India that thanks to our huge forex kitty, now close to 635 billion, that's going to give us protection against the fallout of Fed's action. But as someone who lived through the taper tantrums of 2008, 2009, can any emerging market really take comfort, be immune from the fallout of Fed actions?
The quick answer is no. It gives us a buffer, no doubt, and we should be comfortable that that buffer is a good one. But at the same time, that doesn't absolve us from getting all our other macroeconomic indicators in place. So as you know, for example, the current account deficit has been expanding. We are seeing gold purchases again becoming a bigger part. Oil, of course, is an important component. And the surging demand in the country is certainly increasing imports. Yes, our exports have done well, but our current account deficit is expanding. So that's a cause for some amount of not so much concern, but attention. We should pay attention to it. It's not yet at the point where we have to be overly concerned, but certainly we shouldn't ignore it. At the same time, I think the inflation in the country is something to keep track of. As you know, a number of emerging markets already have started raising interest rates. Brazil, for example, has been doing it for quite some time, partly because of the higher inflation in those countries. We also have an enormous amount of liquidity out there, and that's something to also think about. The broader point is that markets are interconnected. As interest rates move up in the US, they will start moving up in the rest of the world. And to some extent, we should be prepared for that. That will create, some difficulties in financing that were not there in the past when interest rates were lower.
Let me turn specifically to India's growth story. Advanced estimates for 21-22 suggest the Indian economy is back to where it was for the pre-pandemic years, with growth projected to grow at 9.2 this fiscal. However, many experts, including your predecessor at the Reserve Bank of India, Dr. Subba Rao, argue that what we are going in for is a two-speed recovery, a K-shaped recovery, with those in the bottom of the pyramid, such as those in the informal sector workers, yet to recover much lost ground. Would you agree? And what are the dangers of a K-shaped recovery?
Well, I think there are bright spots and dark spots in the Indian economy. And I think we should be aware of both. It's wrong to be overly pessimistic. It's wrong to be excessively optimistic. On the optimistic side, because of the tremendous global demand, I think any exporting industry is starting to do really quite well. And of course, the IT industry is going gangbusters at this point. I spoke with an IT CEO the other day who said it's just impossible to find workers in India today. So same phenomenon as in the US. So that's benefiting from global demand. Also, maybe some larger companies have paid down their debts. They're showing high profits. They're now focusing more on automation. that's also increasing demand for IT in the country. So that's one side of it. And take also any kind of industry targeting the rich, Asian paints, people like that. They're doing very well because there is a lot of pent-up demand. The upper middle class in service jobs have been able to continue working during the pandemic without stop. And so things are going quite well for that sector. On the other hand, take the lower middle class, take those in service, high contact service industries, etc., and they've had a very, very rough time. And the numbers, for example, the fact that agriculture has increased employment from 36% of the labor force to 39%. I mean, no growing country increases employment in agriculture. You want to keep bringing down employment in agriculture. And that's saying we have a real problem with the lower end jobs, that if people find going back to agriculture better than staying in the cities and doing those jobs because they've disappeared or they've shrunk, it is an enormous source of concern. And so what I think you have to worry about is that the lower middle class has been deeply affected. And of course, there are all these numbers floating around, how many have slipped from middle to lower middle, from lower middle to poverty, and any of those numbers are really alarming. They're all crude because we don't get at this informal segment of the economy. We don't measure it properly, but any numbers there are quite alarming. And you talk to small and medium enterprises, they are in a fair amount of difficulty. So the bright spot, the big enterprises, the export enterprises, the not so bright spots, in fact, the dark spots, the informal sector, the small and medium enterprises, even agriculture. I mean, if you look at two-wheeler sales, for example, which is propped up, the lower end of the two-wheeler propped up by strong agricultural demand, even that is not showing up as strongly. So we have a real consumption problem. And that's because the lower end, less well-off segments of our population have done really quite badly in this recession. Look at consumption, for example. You said we've got back to where we were in terms of growth, but look at consumption. It fell tremendously last year, and it's come up only by about 6.8% this year. So it's below where it was. And consumption falling while the upper middle class is growing quite strongly means the lower middle class, as well as the poor, have suffered quite substantially. So we ignore this at our peril because it's telling us this is where all the problems start in the economy, but it's also where our future lies, right? So before I end on this dark segment, think of the kids who haven't been in school.
Sure.
They've been out of school now in some states for 2 years. How do you get them back? And unless you have a pathway for getting them back into school, back into learning, they've actually fallen 3 years behind because they've forgotten a year worth of school, having not been in a proper school since then. And so when you get them back, their parents are going to say, where are you? What are you doing? And they will figure out that these kids are just not keeping up if they brought back into the same class in the same way. And as a result, you're going to see a very high dropout rate, many more girls getting married off, boys put into agricultural jobs, low-end jobs. Our future is at stake if we don't bring these kids back into school in the proper way. And so I think these are some of the things we should be thinking about seriously across the country. It's not one state or it's not a center. It's everyone has to think about this and how to remedy it.